Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbart Gaming. In today's video, I'll be taking a look at the Sega 8-bit line of game consoles and computers. This includes the SG1000, SC3000, SG1000 II, the Mark III, and the Sega Master System. It sounds like a lot, but really each system was iterative either in physical design or with slightly upgraded guts, with the one minor exception being the SC3000, which was a computer that came out at the same time as the SG1000. Anywho, let's get on with it. 1. The SG1000 released on the same day as the Famicom in Japan. Here's one that you may know, but it's worth including to make sure everyone knows. Sega's first home game console, the SG1000, along with its computer variant, the SC3000, were released in Japan on July 15, 1983. While this date may seem insignificant on its own, it was, of course, the same day that the Famicom, which we know better as the NES, was released in Japan. For two systems released on the same day, the NES kind of trounces the SG1000 hardware-wise. Personally, I find it a little strange that Sega went with such common off-the-shelf parts for their first game system when they were known even at the time for having some decently powerful arcade boards. Contrary to what has become popular belief, in the early going the SG1000 actually did okay for itself. It had games coming along at a brisker pace than the Famicom, and the Famicom would even suffer a voluntary recall. The good times would not keep rolling for the SG1000, nor its computer counterpart, however. 2 years after release, Sega had sold approximately 2 million systems in the SG family in Japan. Nintendo had recovered from their early woes to overtake the SG1000 and sell more than double the amount of Famicom systems in that same time frame. The SG1000 didn't make the trip to the West, but it did manage to release in a few other territories like New Zealand. There's sort of one crazy exception though, which I'll talk about in just a few seconds. 2. The SG1000 had very similar hardware to the ColecoVision and MSX computer. Calling the SG1000 uninspired would perhaps be overly kind. Hardware-wise, Sega's first game system is basically the same as the ColecoVision. It uses the same CPU, same video processor, and same sound chip. There's some conflicting information on what type of RAM and exactly how much each system had, but chances are there were some minor differences there. Mainly, without getting too much into the weeds, the addresses where the program started on cartridges was different between the SG1000 and ColecoVision, which prevented them from being compatible with one another. Except for one case. Remember when I said a whole minute or two ago that the SG1000 wasn't released in America? Well, there's one teeny tiny sort of exception to that. You see, there was this little system developed in Taiwan manufactured by Bit Corporation. Forgive me if I mangle the pronunciation, but it was known as the Shuang Zhao JF50 at first, and it was later referred to as the Dyna 2-in-1. This little hybrid system played both ColecoVision and SG1000 games. Heck, the system even looks like something from the SG1000 line of consoles, sporting a very similar design to the SG1000 Mark II. It's purported that Sega didn't even know this thing existed, which seems well within the realm of possibility, but who knows for sure. Anyway, the system was picked up by Telegames in the US all the way in 1988, when its hardware would have been ancient. It was dubbed the Telegames Personal Arcade. It's unclear if the system was actually licensed from ColecoVision, but we know for sure it definitely was not authorized by Sega. The SG1000 compatibility wasn't even advertised on the thing, since, well, the SG1000 and its games weren't released in America. This Frankenstein of a console was only sold via mail-order catalog, and reports say its hardware is unreliable as it's prone to breaking down. 3. Sega's full 8-bit line was iterative in design or hardware. Alright, let's take this on, shall we? The original SG1000, well, it had some design flaws. Primarily, the controller is notoriously awful and is permanently attached to the console, which was not uncommon for the time. About a year after the original release, Sega put out the SG1000 II. The system was the same hardware-wise as the original, but made several cosmetic design changes. It replaced the awkward attached joystick with a removable gamepad. It moved the expansion port to the front and was just slightly streamlined when compared to the original. 1 year after that, in 1985, Sega released their next update, the Sega Mark III. This is the hardware we'd get in the West as the Sega Master System, just in a differently designed shell. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. The Mark III, well, just looking at it, you'd be forgiven for mistaking it for the SG1000 Mark II. It looks really similar. It's got a slightly improved gamepad, and the ports are on the front instead of the back now. But it's the insides that are substantially different. It has a much improved VDP, or video display processor, and more RAM. The Mark III was more than a match for the NES hardware-wise, with smooth scrolling in all directions, plenty of on-screen sprites, and more on-screen colors than Nintendo's hardware. But as we know, it's all about the games, not the specs. When the Mark III came west, it was redubbed the Sega Master System. Well, sort of, but we'll come to that point shortly. But it sported a sleek, futuristic black and red case. Internally, there were no real changes from the Mark III, however. But that's not the case with the Sega Master System's Japanese release. We'll talk about that in the next fact, so I don't want to spoil a cute little story about it here. 4. Yuji Naka created the FM sound unit without permission from Sega, and also added FM music into the Master System port of Outrun without their permission. Yuji Naka was at the helm of a few Sega Arcade to Master System ports during the system's heyday. Two such games were the Master System ports of Space Harrier and Outrun. These games were hugely popular in the arcade, and were both known for having great soundtracks. When it came time to develop the Mark III port of Outrun, Yuji Naka just didn't like that the soundtrack felt weak using the included PSG. So without permission, he developed the FM sound unit for the Sega Mark III. This device contained a Yamaha 2413 FM sound chip, which was a pretty limited chip that was also used in the MSX's FM sound add-on. While the FM sound unit did not produce sounds or music on par with the more advanced Sega arcade games, it did sound better than the PSG that the Master System had relied on to create music and sound up until that point. The unit was sold separately at first and was compatible with only the Mark III. Which brings us to the Japanese release of the Sega Master System. One of the biggest changes made in the Japanese release of the hardware was the addition of the FM sound unit. You see, it was built right into the new system without the need to purchase a separate add-on. Now despite this, there still wasn't FM sound in every Master System game released after this point, even in Japan. Now, even though the Master System had this FM sound unit built right into it, all games still had to be compatible with the Mark III, so they all included PSG soundtracks and sound effects. But not every game released from this point forward would include FM sound, as that had to be added manually. Interestingly enough, the Japanese Sega Master System was built in such a way that it could have used the FM sound and PSG sound chips together, just like the Mega Drive would do a few years later. But no games actually used this functionality. Why not? Well, because while the Sega Master System could support that, the Mark III, with a separate FM sound unit attached, could not. Sadly, FM sound for Sega Master System games was pretty much limited to Japan and a select few other regions. Most of the world would only ever have PSG sound come out of their Sega Master Systems. 5. The Sega Master System is still being manufactured today in Brazil. For various reasons, the video game situation in Brazil is quite a bit different than in many other places in the world. A lot of this had to do with taxes on importing game systems manufactured in other countries. This tax didn't exist on systems that were manufactured in Brazil itself. Tectoy was able to get the license to manufacture and distribute the Master System in Brazil, where it exploded in popularity, in large part because it was more affordable compared to other systems there. The crazy thing is, at least as of the time I've written this script in February of 2022, they still make variations of the Sega Master System in Brazil, like this one here. These newer versions of the Master System ditch the cartridge slot and usually include well over 100 games built right in. I'm not quite sure why they use the Genesis 6-button controllers on these things, since the SMS only recognizes 2 buttons, but, well, there you are. So what do these things cost these days? Well, when converted to US dollars, we're looking at roughly $50, which isn't even too bad considering you get the system, 2 controllers, and 132 games. Oh, and yeah, the Sega Master System is by far the longest continually manufactured game system in history because of the situation with it in Brazil. 6. Phantasy Star 2 was originally supposed to be a Sega Master System game. Phantasy Star 2 began development in 1988 as a Sega Master System title, but Sega made the wise decision to shift the platform from the ailing Sega Master System to the shiny new Mega Drive. This change caused a lot of shuffling and resulted in alterations to some of the team members working on the game, and even to the very story itself. In the original design of the game, and I'll link a source article in the description below by the way, the main character would have been Lutz. In the West, you may know this character better from the original game as Noah. Now, Phantasy Star 2 would have began with Lutz waking up from a 1,000-year sleep that saw his abilities change, making him more of a fighter than a magic user. But wait, there's more. The plot would have seen Lutz traveling back in time and saving Alice from Dark Force when she was just a little baby. Why didn't any of this stuff make it into the final game? Well, Yuji Naka, who was part of the team, felt that Lutz was too bland to be the main character of the game. This led to some changes to the story which saw Lutz relegated to a cameo appearance toward the end of the game just before its climax. An interesting note on this one is that when the platform was shifted from the Master System to the Mega Drive, the schedule for the game's development did not change, so the team had to complete the game on brand new hardware in 6 months, which probably goes a long way in explaining why it seemed a lot more sterile than the original, with greatness clearly locked inside it, yet largely leashed up. 7. What most people think of as the Sega Master System, originally wasn't. Get ready to have your minds blown. Well, maybe not blown, but at least gently disturbed. When the Mark III came to the US, it was originally intended to be available in 2 packages. One that contained just the console and a couple of controllers, and a deluxe package that had all of that plus a light gun and some games. The latter, more complete deluxe package was dubbed the Sega Master System. But what about the smaller package? Everyone neglects small packages, am I right? Anyway, the other package with just the system and 2 controllers was to be known as the Sega Base System. The console itself was initially referred to as the Sega Base System or Power Base. This nomenclature would be revived when the Genesis came around a few years later, as the peripheral required to play Master System games on the new 16-bit console was dubbed the Power Base Converter. Of course, even in those days, everyone called all variations of it the Sega Master System. At least, everyone that even knew what the thing was back in 1986 and 1987. You'd be surprised how many people had no idea what a quote-unquote Sega was in the general population in the US back then. On a similar note, when Tonka took over distribution of the SMS in the United States, they released another package that was just called the Sega Video Game System. This one included the SMS, controllers, light phaser, 3D glasses, and the game Missile Defense 3D. So many names for one little system. 8. The SMS pause button was on the system itself. This is one of those things that just sort of falls by the wayside for people who didn't actually own the system when it was new. You might just take for granted that you'd have the ability to pause your game from your controller. But nope, not on the Sega Master System, nor the Atari 7800, nor several other old-school consoles. If they had pause buttons at all, they were usually on the system. Really, this didn't change until the NES came along and added the start button, which pretty much every new console from that point afterward mimicked. So if you were playing an intense game of Space Harrier and someone knocked on the door, you better hope you were sitting close to the system and the TV. Otherwise, you might die between the time you got up and the time you actually managed to press the pause button. Now you might be wondering, why didn't Sega just add an extra button to the controller for start and pause? I would guess that it's probably because of maintaining the backward compatibility with the SG1000 in Japan. And if that is the case, I mean, this is an instance where backwards compatibility, I would say, actually harmed the new system, because it stopped them from taking a step forward. I don't think there's anyone that can argue that it would not have been to Sega's benefit to add an extra button onto the controller for start and pause, even if it only worked in native Master System games. Oh well, at least Sega learned their lesson and put the start-pause button on the Genesis controller. 9. The cartridges were different shapes in Japan and the US. Right now, my retro gaming friends, you are looking at something that is probably familiar to most of you. This is what an American Sega Master System cartridge looked like. It was horizontally aligned and wider than it was tall. It was very similar to the shape Sega would use for Genesis cartridges, only on that system they would round the edges and change the connectors slightly. But did you know that in Japan, Sega Mark III/Master System games look like this? Yeah, they kind of look like Atari 2600 cartridges almost, don't they? They're vertically aligned and taller than they are wide, basically the complete opposite of the US and European cart designs. They also had much nicer labels with actual graphics, and you can see that Sega had a penchant for including the storage capacity of the cartridges on the box art and cartridges even back in those days. 10. It was released in South Korea by Samsung as the Game Boy. Much like some of the other systems I've shown you in prior 11 Facts episodes, the Mark III/SMS made its way to Korea by way of Samsung and saw a drastic name change, even though the design was basically intact. What you're looking at now is the Samsung Game Boy. Or Gam Star Boy, whatever, I don't know exactly how it was pronounced. If there's anyone watching this that lived in South Korea at the time or is South Korean natively, and you can shed some light on the pronunciation, please do so in the comments, I would greatly appreciate it. Anyway, this is the version of the system they got in South Korea. One thing that was different in this region versus the others was the control pad. The SMS used sort of a flattened square pad with rounded edges in most places that sat in a sharply rectangular case, not unlike the NES controller. The Game Boy controller was rounded, basically pill-shaped, with a more NES-like cross pad and for some reason square buttons. I'd love to see this in person and try it out, but I suspect I will never have that opportunity. Still, it's good to have at least one unachievable goal in life, I suppose. 11. Multi-fact. Check out some other ways to play Sega Master System games. Sega Master System games could be played on a pretty large variety of hardware. Perhaps most famously, you could purchase a power base converter for the Sega Genesis and play your Sega Master System titles on it just fine. Nearly all of them worked 100%, but there are some games that just don't work with a Genesis controller and require a real SMS controller. There are 9 of those, in fact, which include games like Alien Syndrome and Wonder Boy in Monsterland. And finally, there are 2 games that don't work at all on the power base converter, and those are F-16 Fighting Falcon and Alien 3. Another thing you can do in the early 90s was play Master System games on the Master Gear converter. This allowed you to play Sega Master System games on your Game Gear. Again, most games worked fine, but there were a few that had issues. Now, Majesco did a re-release of the Game Gear in the late 90s, and the original Master Gear doesn't work on that newer system. But there was a newer version of the peripheral that was made called the Master Gear Converter 2, and this one did work on it. There were a few other similar accessories from other companies as well, like the cleverly named Gear Master. Yes, for real. Finally, you could also, of course, play Sega Master System games on a Sega Master System 2. Mostly. The Master System 2 was Sega's cost-reduced and greatly cut-back re-release of the console, positioned as a cheaper alternative to the Genesis/Mega Drive. Most versions came with Alex Kidd in Miracle World built right into the unit. You could play all your cartridge games. Sega eliminated the card slot, which also eliminated the ability to play 3D games. They got rid of the reset button, got rid of the AV out, and got rid of the expansion port. And they made the power button a super cheap-looking slider switch. Personally, I think the biggest problem was getting rid of the AV out, which forces you to play the thing via RF unless you decide to mod it. Finally, there are some converters that let you play games from one region in another. Some of these handy-dandy things will even let you play SG1000 games on your US Sega Master System. Alright, there you are. So now that you know some facts, how about some speculation? Why wasn't the SMS more popular in Japan and the US? I think that Sega had earned kind of a bad reputation for moving on from hardware relatively quickly in Japan. I mean, in the course of about 3 years, they went from the SG1000 to the Mark III, and then the SMS right after. Meanwhile, Nintendo just kept plugging away on the original Famicom. They added some upgrades to the cartridges instead of the hardware. And here's another bonus fact. Sega did have a few different versions of mappers they used in the SMS cards, but the vast majority of the library uses the normal Sega mapper. Some games from Codemasters and some Korean games are famous for using different mappers, and also some of those hacked ports from the MSX computer. Now, why wasn't the Master System bigger in the US? Well, that's a tougher question to answer, but I think it has to do with a few things. Primarily, I'd say it was Nintendo's stranglehold on third parties, but it was also things like it wasn't distributed as well as the NES, their advertising wasn't as strong, and, you've seen Sega Master System box art. That was not appealing to people in 1986 and 1987. So tell me, do you think I left out anything that was especially interesting or important about the Sega Master System? Did you have a Sega Master System back in the day, or do you have one now? What did you think was the most interesting thing about it? Let me know in the comments. That brings us to the end of another video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed it, please like and share it. If you haven't yet, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. If you weren't aware, I now have Patreon and Ko-fi pages if you'd like to help support the work that I do on this channel. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.